Today we're going to talk a little bit about histology and tissues and kind of what's going on with those. So when we were talking about kind of back in chapter 1, we were talking a little bit about how there's different levels or hierarchy of a lot of the stuff here. And after the cellular level, we kind of get to the level of tissues. What it really kind of gets down to is we do have a ton of cells in the body. Estimates about 38 trillion cells. Again, kind of not a number that's really fathomable anyways. You can't really wrap your head around it, that big a number. Main thing it kind of comes down to is we don't have any cell in our body that can do everything the body needs. So again, a lot of times we have cells of similar shape and function that are grouped together that we term tissues. And the study of this is histology. There is whole courses devoted to this. In the spring I teach the Intro to Histology course, which is basically looking at the study of these tissues, kind of an A&P light, but with a lot more depth on just the tissues. When it comes down to it, there is 4 main types of tissues. You have your epithelial tissue, which is mainly what we're going to talk about here in the first few episodes here of this. We'll also talk about connective tissue. To me, these are the 2 tissue types that we talk about in a lot more detail early on in A&P. We end up having a muscular system chapter, so we delve a lot more into the tissue structure and of it there. Same thing with the nervous tissue. We talk a lot more about nervous cells and its tissue structure in that chapter more than we do in this one. We just, for this, just want to introduce the idea that it is one of the tissue types. So epithelial tissue, kind of a cover lining, it's protective. Connective tissue, it's things from bone all the way to blood. A lot of supporting types of connective tissue along with other types as well. Muscle is really about movement, so you can see the heart over there with cardiac muscle. We also have skeletal and smooth muscle, and again, the nervous system is part of that command and control of these. So what we're really going to be looking at here is these key questions are: what are some of the different types of tissues in the body, and where are they, and what are they doing? So again, we're going to talk a lot more in detail about epithelial tissue first, then connective tissue, and then we'll introduce the muscle and nervous tissue, but again, spend a lot more time on those in later chapters. So the first one we're going to talk about is epithelial tissue. This is going to be covering it of the body, so even the picture on the right has more than one type of tissue on there. That is not all epithelial tissue. But if we're looking at this image over here, it's only this upper part right here that is the mainly epithelial tissue along with some of the glands. But the main thing this one is doing is it covers the surface of the body, lines the openings of the body, going to be involved in a number of different things, lines the intestines, for example. Again, a number of different functions to it. So, and these are the things that a lot of times I want you to kind of come back to, because, again, if we think about the structure of this, of a particular tissue type, we're going to see that a lot of times the structure of it is going to be very related to what it's good at doing. So something that is a single thin layer cell is probably not going to be good at protection, but a multi-layered cell, set of tissues, a multicellular layer tissue is probably going to be better at protection. So protection is one of the main things that epithelial tissue is doing. The other big things here are what we kind of refer, it's 2 and 4 on this one, absorption and secretion. So a lot of our epithelial tissue is making hormones or other secretions, as well as lining different cavities that are going to be involved with absorbing a lot of nutrients, so the digestive tract, for example. Another thing that this is able to do is lets kind of, to me, filtration happen, as well as the idea of allowing thin layers for diffusion or osmosis to happen as well. So you can kind of group that with that number 5 there, that filtration idea. You could also say kind of diffusion or osmosis. Sensory reception, a lot of your epithelial tissue is going to have nervous tissue coming into it, which helps with sensory reception. It is a place where a lot of these are found. The epithelial tissue itself is not doing the sensory reception. So, again, on the one over to the right here, a lot of it would be here, but these glands right here, this gland right here, those are all epithelial glands as well. So, when we talk about these different tissue types, a lot of times we're going to talk about kind of what makes them up and what makes them unique. So the main thing is we just talked about the functions of epithelial tissue. What we're going to kind of get into now is the characteristics. And one of the things I always tell students is pay attention to these on questions, because if I ask you what is a function of epithelial tissue, I don't want that the cells are really tightly connected. That is a characteristic of it, and vice versa is also true. So what are these characteristics that make epithelial tissue unique from other tissue types? The simplest one to say here is epithelial tissue is very cellular. And that sounds kind of funny to say, because aren't all the tissues made of cells? Yes, they all have cells in them. But the main thing when you look at epithelial tissue is it's almost entirely cells. There's almost no space in this tissue. So you're going to have a lot of these cells really tightly connected to one another. So this would be all epithelial tissue here, and you can see there's no space in between. Here's an actual picture of that tissue over on the right. But you can see not a lot of space between the cells. The other thing with these cells is they're generally really well connected through some of those cellular junctions, those tight junctions and desmosomes, which is kind of shown on this picture right here, how they're spot welded together, held really tightly. Again, if you think about when you get a sunburn, does your skin cells fall off one at a time? No, a lot of times you'll have skin that peels. You'll peel a sheet of that off. And that means even though that those cells are dead, they're still really well connected to one another, so they peel off all together. So lots of cells, not a lot of space, really well connected cells. And again, makes sense for protection on this one in that, to me, a wall is a nice protective thing, but if there's big holes in the wall, it's not really doing a lot. Same idea with the skin, for example. Skin's a really good protective epithelial tissue, but if there's a big hole in that skin, it's much more likely to get an infection because it's not well connected to the surrounding cells. Another thing that epithelial cells have is something called polarity, meaning there's kind of a top and a bottom to these ones. So almost all epithelial is going to be tissue is going to be open to some type of area. So it might be the inside of a duct, something like circle like this, the lumen. It might be the surface of the body right here. We could also be open to a cavity on the inside of the body. The main thing is whatever it's open to is the apical side or luminal side of that. So if you're looking at the cells right here, this would be the apical side. And you can see this polarity also sometimes goes to like receptors or protein distribution on the cells, that there will be sometimes some specific expression only on this apical side or only on the basal side. But the main thing is these cells, these layers have a top and a bottom. The one that's open to the cavity or space is the apical side. The one that's underneath that is the basal side. And what we are going to see is one of the other things along with this is this next point at the bottom here is that there's always going to be what we call a basement membrane underneath this. So we're always going to have a layer of connective tissue or basement membrane underneath that basal side of the cells. So it's kind of defining line of beneath this is not epithelial tissue, above this is. That is that basement membrane made of things like collagen and fibronectin and laminin and a lot of these other types of proteins. Another thing with epithelial tissue is it does not have blood vessels. If you've ever been cutting something and you accidentally slice your finger a little bit and you look down and you're like, oh good, it's not bleeding, I didn't cut it that bad. What you did on that one is you actually just cut into the epithelial tissue, and the reason it's not bleeding is because there is no blood vessels in epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is avascular. There's going to be good blood supply underneath that epithelial tissue, but it's going to be beneath the basement membrane. It's not going to be within the epithelial tissue. And finally, it has a good ability to regenerate. Again, think about the skin. As soon as you damage skin, think about as a kid how many times you skinned your knee or something. If that never healed, if it couldn't regenerate, would it be very protective? Not really. So we have these cells that are continually dividing that can replace and repair damage to this tissue. And really the last kind of thing to look at here is just how we basically classify these, and then what we're going to do is we're going to work our way through a number of the different types of epithelial tissue. But really the basic naming system has to go with the number of layers as well as the shape of the cells. So the number of layers, this one's pretty straightforward. If there's a single layer of cells above that basement membrane, this is referred to as a simple epithelium. If there's two or more layers, it's stratified epithelium. So you can kind of see here, one layer, simple epithelium, multiple layers, stratified. But again, it's anything two or more, it's going to be stratified epithelium. The other thing that we have going on is we have three main cell shapes that we see in a lot of these tissues. So you have what are called squamous cells. They're kind of flat. If you look at them from the top, they're not necessarily hexagonal. Sometimes they look more like puzzle pieces. If you were to zoom in on your skin, you could see this. But these are very flat, scale-like cells. Those are squamous cells. You have cells that are cube-shaped, same height and width. So you can kind of see that right here. Height and width are kind of similar. Again, it doesn't have to be square to be cuboidal. It can be more rounded off, still a cuboidal cell. And then finally, you have these cells that are taller than they are wide, and that would be a columnar cell. So like a column on a building, tall, skinny columns. These ones, a lot of times you'll see the nucleus closer to the bottom. And then if you kind of combine these things, you can kind of see how we can get a number of different cell types. So if you have simple squamous and stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, and you can do the same thing with columnars. You can see we can get up to about 6 different types of epithelium, which all of those actually do exist. You have that first part is the number of epithelial cell layers. Second part, shape of the cells. And again, when we start talking about the stratified ones, it's always going to be the shape of the cell at that apical surface. So even if the cell is more column shaped on the bottom, if it's square at the top, it's stratified cuboidal. And we'll see this a little bit later on. So again, simple epithelium, 1 layer thick. Not surprisingly, this is going to be things where filtration, diffusion, osmosis allowed to happen through these really easily. Some absorption of secretion, so you can see some places where you might find some of this. Stratified epithelium, generally going to be a little bit more protective. But we also see a lot of, even on some of these stratified types, a lot of absorption and secretion that can happen on these. There is a kind of weird type here that we'll talk about in more detail when we get to it, and that is pseudostratified. It's basically, pseudo means fake, so fake stratified epithelium. What this really has going on here is all the cells aren't the same height. All the cells are in contact with the basement membrane, so in reality there's 1 layer, but all of them are not at the apical surface. What this means is the cells look like they're multi-layered, but they're not. And that is pseudostratified epithelium. Again, the cell shapes, flat, irregular, weird looking ones are the squamous one here, really flat cells. Cuboidal, height and width are similar. Can be a little bit more rounded off, but cuboidal on that one, where you can get columnar cells. These are tall and skinny cells, more sausage shape or oval shaped nucleus. And then the other weird type, and we'll see this again when we get into the different cell types here outside of those 6 from that basic naming system that you can get, there is something called transitional ones here that really change shape depending on whether or not the epithelium is being stretched. And if we think about the bladder, that's where that needs to happen. We really see this only in the urinary system. And these are cells that can kind of flatten out, look more like normal epithelium when they're stretched, but kind of really looks a little bit more disorganized when it's relaxed. So if you kind of go through the basic naming system of shapes and layers, you can see you get the basic 6 off of that, along with that couple of specialized types of the transitional epithelium and the pseudostratified columnar epithelium is the other distinct type. So we're going to see, we're going to go through in the next one here, the 8 different types of epithelium. Again, on a lot of these ones, and I'll say it on the next one as well, based on the name, know what the tissue should look like. I would say know which functions it's going to be good at, and then know some places where you could find it in the body. Again, I'm never going to ask you to give me the list of every place you could find it, but on a lot of questions, where would you find this type of epithelium? Here's the multiple choice. Those are all easy questions to ask on the tissues, especially on the epithelium here. But again, with almost all the tissues, based on its name, what does it look like? What is its basic structure? Kind of what would it be good at? Where would you find it? Those are the main ideas that you're going to be needing to know for a vast majority of your questions on this stuff. So next time we'll pick up with the different epithelial subtypes and what's going on with those.